Welcome to Almost Here, Round the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies poised to transform our lives for better or worse are the focus of this podcast. Almost here means these technologies are now here and starting to be used, or just around the corner, from Bitcoin to artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Future Tech Podcast. My guest today is Dr. James Blum. He's chairman of the advisory board of a company called CLEW Medical. So, Dr. Blum or James, how you doing today?
It's great to be here. It's a beautiful day and always a great opportunity to talk about the exciting things that are being done at CLEW.
Well, great. Tell me about what's the premise of the company, first of all.
So, CLEW is a artificial intelligence in applied to medicine company, and the original goal of the organization was to start looking at prediction of clinical deterioration of patients that are most vulnerable, those in the intensive care unit, spawned by deaths of patients with potentially preventable problems that would start to occur in the ICU, but may be left undetected for a variety of reasons. And the idea behind the original founding of the company was that there's a lot of high-level advanced monitoring that we use in intensive care units to help assess patients, but frequently the signals that we get from those patients aren't adequately interpreted by people. And there was the thought that there could be artificial intelligence applied to those signals to detect changes in those patients earlier.
What's the typical suite of things that are monitored when someone's in ICU?
Right. So we start off in the ICU with very basic known monitoring that you may see on a screen in a movie or in a television show. Things that continuously monitor someone's heart rate, their respiratory rate, their blood pressure, and something called their O2 saturation, or their saturation of the blood with the amount of oxygen they have in it. Those are sort of the routine things that are monitored. Those are collected routinely. Those vital signs are collected every hour in an intensive care unit, maybe a little more frequently. And then there's a series of laboratory tests that we follow in patients. But as patients become sicker or become more concerned about various organ systems that start to fail, we have other forms of monitoring that we can use in patients, things that look at pressures inside the heart, flow of blood through the heart, things that are looking at the blood pressure beat by beat, things that help us look at the heart rhythm a little more closely. And all of those data points are also used to help monitor patients. In the official medical record in a very sick patient in the intensive care unit, it's not unlikely that there's about 4,000 individual data points collected per day. But that's actually a minuscule amount of information compared to what is literally streamed across screens and just deposited into the ether because it's a waveform or something like that. So a patient can generate gigabytes of data per day potentially in the intensive care unit.
So right now, even with the data that is generated, I would figure that it's not even looked at unless there's an aberration. There's a sudden change in something or a drop or an increase. I thought it's just, I think they call it like management by exception. They just look for alarms or errors and otherwise don't look at it, right?
There is a lot of that goes on in an intensive care unit, particularly in a sick patient or a patient that their physiology is changing. But believe it or not, your physician every day is charged with examining, if you're really sick, all 4,500 data points that are generated and seeing what the difference may be. And so it is not uncommon that someone can spend a lot of time looking at that data. But you're right, it's very true. The vast majority of things that draw people's attention and certainly generate action is management by exception and when things change in a patient.
Well, also, too, I figure the intensive care units are very busy, and then when there's an emergency, that sucks up everyone's attention. And then, I don't know, I also figure it probably would be tiring to look at that much, or first of all, impossible, but then tiring to look at that data every day and say, all right, what does this mean? What does this mean? So I see how an AI helper would be like super important for it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so it becomes very obvious that fatigue sets in, or trends that are very slowly creeping up on people don't become apparent until much later in the course. Whereas some type of AI would definitely say, oh, there's a change in this. Perhaps you want to be a little more focused, or perhaps there's a change in 3 or 4 or 5 parameters, all of which may make you suspect that something is going awry. So that's where CLEW started its base in the intensive care unit. And there are other companies that work in this space. There's not a lot of companies that work in this space, but there are some. But many of them are generating simply an index that says something bad is going to happen to this patient in the future. And CLEW really took the approach of saying, they're going to approach the view of the patient by saying, what actually does CLEW think is going to go wrong? So they're developing particular algorithms in the intensive care unit space, looking at patient going to require mechanical ventilation. Their breathing is going to become so labored or so difficult that they're going to require mechanical ventilation in the next 6 hours. Or the patient's going to require blood pressure medications to keep their blood pressure up because they're going into shock. And the idea behind these things is not that, oh, we'll do these things sooner. That may be one of the interactions that people have, but it would be that you could potentially intervene and avoid those potential problems. Another target for them is the early onset of sepsis in patients, and so detecting that massive infection, the early stages of that, where antibiotics could be administered earlier in the course of that patient's disease state, and potentially treated earlier with a better outcome. So that's where the company really started.
Okay, a quick question before we go on. What are some surprising or interesting statistics about intensive care units? I would bet you've seen a few. I don't know what they are, but what percentage of patients come out of there okay, or what percentage fail and die? I know it varies per place, but are there any industry stats that are shocking?
Yeah, so it's highly variable. And so for patients that are after surgery, surgical intensive care units, mortality for hospital stays is frequently cited to be about 5%. For all comers that are admitted to that ICU. Now, granted, there are some disease states that we know are likely to be catastrophic, and some where we say this patient's being admitted to the ICU for monitoring, and we really don't foresee them having a problem. But in general, in a surgical intensive care unit, we say about 5% mortality. Medical intensive care units are much more variable based on the nature of the patients that are admitted to them, with mortality ranging anywhere from 10 to 50% of patients that are admitted to the ICU ultimately succumbing during that hospitalization. They may not pass in the ICU, but getting out of the hospital is a series of barriers that are presented to those patients, and ultimately some of them succumb to things not in the ICU but outside of it.
What kind of conditions have like a very rapid onset that are very difficult to treat? Like sepsis, one of them, or where do you see, if you could only pick a few things, where would the AI immediately be most beneficial, you think?
Yeah, so I think in the ICU, sepsis is definitely a target. And this is actually a space where a lot of people are doing work looking for sepsis, but that's actually a relatively rare occurrence that someone's in the ICU already and then becomes septic. It does happen, but it's not a high target item. To be honest with you, a lot of what happens in the ICU that causes patients to subsequently deteriorate is frequently associated with their disease states, and they may end up becoming more labored in their breathing. They may end up having a lot of fluid that we've given them earlier in the state of their disease state that then starts to mobilize and go to their lungs, and that can cause difficulty for them to breathe. And so we can use essentially medications to cause patients to urinate and get rid of some of that fluid. That's a very common problem that we see. We also see patients with heart rhythms that are abnormal, that aren't necessarily constantly abnormal, that can be potentially detected, that can keep them in the ICU or can cause them to deteriorate relatively quickly, that we might be able to intervene on earlier. And then there are patients that are otherwise have weak hearts, that we know have weak hearts, and they're in the ICU, and we start to see them deteriorating early on. And the thought would be perhaps we can do things to help the heart pump better rather than necessarily letting the patient deteriorate into other forms of organ dysfunction, so that the heart begins to affect the kidneys and liver and starts to put a patient into multi-system organ failure, which becomes very difficult to treat.
Yeah. So, all right. So we covered, the initial premise of CLEW and what the goal is. So where is CLEW at today, or what projects are in the works, or what have you guys accomplished?
Yeah. So CLEW is very close to bringing the first iteration of their product to market in the ICU, and an early warning system of smart alerts for those things I talked to you about, really focusing on the need for medications to increase blood pressure and respiratory failure. That's a product that's going to be layered originally in electronic ICUs that monitor hundreds of patients. And the reason for that is it's very easy to get that data. And also you have an individual small clinical team that isn't laying their eyes on patients as frequently as someone that is a bedside provider. So we think that that's the early target that can have the most impact. But the company has come to recognize that patients are already in ICUs, are already being watched by really experienced nurses. They frequently have physicians that are comfortable with patients that are really sick. And what they've come to recognize is that the real benefit of applying AI is probably outside of the ICU and across the entire hospital stay, everything from actually before a patient ever enters the hospital to the time they're discharged. And the focus of CLEW is really focused on two things. It's first, improving clinical outcomes for patients, making sure that they get the care they need at the right time, making sure that they aren't getting unnecessary care that they don't need, and then also finding ways to make the hospital more efficient by looking at the patient's physiology, as opposed to just looking at the patient as a lot of there's software now that will go ahead and look at a patient and say this patient is so old and they're admitted for this operation, this is how long they should stay. CLEW's focus is actually much more on looking at the individual patient, knowing more about that patient, including their physiology, to help figure out what's going on with that patient on a moment-to-moment basis, to help advise clinicians and administrators on using the appropriate resources to care for that patient, and to mobilize those resources throughout the hospital.
So what are some examples? Have you hooked the CLEW AI system up to, sample patients? And, what have you seen in the data that maybe, a regular doctor wouldn't see to catch stuff earlier? Or what stage are you at with this?
Right. So in the ICU, the algorithms are being developed and are being tested right now, focus on that respiratory failure and the need for medications to increase blood pressure, or hemodynamic failure. Those algorithms are designed to predict the need for those interventions 2 to 6 hours before they would actually occur. And those the algorithms are being refined right now. The original data sets were collected on hospitals outside of the U.S., and they're currently being refined on data from the U.S. With the expectation that they're going to perform fairly well and get things right roughly 70% to 80% of the time, that it's going to say this patient's going to need some type of intervention. So that's the goal, is to sort of to be at that point. And that's enough, what we would call positive predictive value, that we think that clinicians will really find value in that. Throughout the hospital, they're just starting to work with large data sets on patients that aren't in the ICU. But the initial work they seem to think that they can really generate some pretty significant results in early detection of problems that exist in patients through using published open source algorithms and using some technology that they're developing that's proprietary to CLEW.
So what's involved in getting this into actual use? Do you have to go through like various IRBs, and is it
right? So
considered a medical device or system?
Right. So the process of developing the algorithms is actually done using de-identified data from patients, which goes through the facility's IRB before that data ever graces CLEW. And there's also a mechanism that's used called a BAA, which is a business associates agreement, which if we're working with an entity explicitly to improve quality in those organizations, that gives us the ability to work with de-identified data on patients with the explicit goal of improving the process of care that's delivered in that facility. So that's sort of the first organizational hurdle that occurs with working with a facility and using this data. Once that data is essentially, once the administrative challenge has been overcome, one of the CLEW's major assets has been a rapid ingestion engine of this data. So they have the ability to extract data from multiple electronic medical record platforms into a single unified record that enables them to do the machine learning on that data that's been ingested. And that's really a potent part of CLEW's portfolio is having spent the time to develop this machine learning architecture.
So what would be, how would you consider the project a big success? What kind of metrics are you looking for?
So early on, being focused on patient outcomes, the company is really focusing on finding patients that are going to deteriorate either in the ICU or other places in the hospital. And the goal is to have positive predictive values that are in that sort of 70% range to make sure that we're identifying patients that are going to deteriorate, and then also making sure that we find patients that we think are going to be fine that are fine. But ultimately, the real value of CLEW is going to be in making sure that patients aren't receiving unnecessary care. And that's going to make everybody happy. It'll help get patients out of the hospital sooner. It will help patients save money. It will make the cost of care lower. And the hospital is a dangerous place to be. So finding patients that can be out of the hospital and home safely is a major obstacle. And one of CLEW's real focuses is going to be on making sure that patients that are likely possible candidates to go home actually are able to go home, that the I's are dotted and T's are crossed, such that patients don't need to wait in the hospital another day to get prescriptions written or to have a physical therapy visit set up, or to make sure that they have the right home care so that they can go home. One of CLEW's real focuses is going to be on finding those opportunities to find patients that don't need to be in the hospital, that are actually ahead of their predicted pathway, and finding ways to get them home sooner.
Okay, I see why it'll be more efficient and better priced for the care. Interesting. Okay, yeah. So that's a bigger win than maybe predicting people crashing in various ways and going into cardiac arrest or whatever it is.
Yeah, so the company is really focused first and foremost. The first targets for the company are improving the quality of care that's delivered. And that's why the original efforts have gone into the ICU of finding patients that are going to deteriorate that can be helped and potentially saved. And that's always going to remain the number one focus of the company. But in today's healthcare environment, with continuing costs that seem to escalate, and providers that are running thinner and thinner, being encouraged to see more patients in less time, and less able to focus on dotting the I's and crossing the T's, the goal of CLEW is ultimately to make care better in all domains. So make it safer and less expensive.
Okay. So what's the roadmap for CLEW? How long is it going to be before you're in one or more ICUs and being used?
Yeah, so CLEW is currently running in a couple ICUs in the U.S. It's running at UMass Memorial and is being installed right now at WakeMed for initial testing. The goal is to have a product on the market probably Q1, Q2 of 2019 for the ICU detection, ICU deterioration detection. The kind of larger concept, the whole hospital concept, kind of a control tower for the hospital concept, as they're referring to it, is scheduled to go into essentially develop into the development partners starting in early 2019 with the initial platform, with it actively running in development with development partners in early 2020.
Okay, well that's not long. That's great.
No, it's an aggressive time frame for a medical device company, but it's not your typical medical device company. It's founded by folks from the high tech world, and they're used to getting things done faster than I think your typical medical device company.
Yeah, that's true. Well, very good. So what's the best way for interested parties to get in touch, perhaps to collaborate or to get the CLEW system into their hospital system?
Yeah, so clearly visiting the website first, CLEWmed or CLEWmedical.com is they can get information about the company. They can sort of see where things are going, sort of high level discussions are there. And then if they're interested, they can reach out using the website to get a slide deck and more information that can be sent to them in terms of being an early adopter or a development partner.
Okay. Well, very good. Well, Dr. Blum, thanks for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Hey, it's a pleasure, and look forward to hearing what you bring to our ears in the future.
You have been listening to Almost Here, Around the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Subscribe to this podcast, post a review to discover more future technologies that are poised to transform our lives for better or worse, such as Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.